Welcome to Software Without Borders, where we delve into the limitless potential of software and how it's transforming businesses and industries worldwide. I'm your co-host, Andy Hilliard, CEO of Accelerance, and with me today is my co-host, Olivier Poulard, Managing Director of Software Strategies at Accelerance. In this episode, we're exploring the transformative role of AI and robotics in law enforcement technology. Our guest, Roman Grigorii, is an accomplished software engineer and researcher with a PhD in mechanical engineering from Northwestern. Roman's work focuses on embedding AI into robotics systems, advancing computer vision technologies, and designing tools that enhance safety and efficiency for law enforcement. If you're intrigued by how AI and robotics are shaping critical fields, this episode is for you. So Roman, can you share a little bit about in your journey with regards to AI, robotics, and computer vision, and what initially drew you into the field?
Yeah, sure. So AI, I think in the past couple of years, it's gotten a lot of attention, but fundamentally, it's quite an interesting concept that you can create models around these very high dimensional nonlinear data, and then you can extract key information without a lot of oversight from an individual, a lot of manual labor, you could say. So it's a very interesting concept, just on theoretical level, but it also has a lot of applications to our society today. That's riddled with a lot of data that seems like noise, and a lot of necessity for analyzing and drawing some conclusions from it. So it's a very useful field, you could say. It's not just interesting; it's very useful. So that's why I'm here.
So if you can take me even further back, where did your fascination and interest? What was it as a child? What were the building blocks for your interest and further study?
I think I've always been studious, and that's it's a very high level sort of idea behind it. But with regards to sort of pursuing a PhD, that was just a personal choice in terms of pursuing studies. But specifically with the AI and robotics, I think I have some fascination with the idea that you can virtualize a lot of things. If you really understand a concept such as, piecing details together, like what a human would do, if you really understand the mechanisms behind it, you can replicate it, and you can use it to your advantage to build a tool around it, right? And I think just in general, a lot of engineers I know, what they really are is they're tool makers. They really enjoy creating something very useful for people to use, very simple to understand, and just in general, a tool, for something. So that's my fascination around engineering and in general robotics and AI, is that you're creating sophisticated tools that are supposed to be very easy to use, very intuitive. And that's not an easy thing to do. I think useful tools are the ones that are easy to pick up and they just get integrated into your everyday life without much hurdles. And as an engineer, it's a great reward, I think, to build something that people use every day, that they can't picture their life without, that you create something that everybody picks up and they're just fascinated with how amazing it is. Or maybe they just don't think about it. That would be a reward of itself. Kind of like, like phones are nowadays. We don't really think about the fact that they're so complex and they're doing so many things at once. And we only really realize that it's a machine once it doesn't work.
Tell me a little bit about where you grew up, how you grew up, your family life, and sort of what you were doing as a child within the dynamics of your family that sort of kind of led you to this pursuit.
I don't know if you could draw the conclusion that it led me here, but I'll speak to it a little bit. Absolutely, I grew up in Moldova, which is an Eastern European country right next to Ukraine. Grew up in a very humble means, I would say. Nothing very, I didn't grow up in a huge family with not very wealthy. But recently, now that you mentioned it, actually, recently I was walking through a store with my mom, and they found a huge Lego set, and I remember, I had this thing as a kid. It was like 2,000 pieces, and I also remarked how much cheaper it was back in the day. And I still remember that it's back home, so I need to go get it because I still like it. But yeah, building stuff, and I would say one of the hallmarks of growing up back in Moldova is that because we don't have we're not very well off. A lot of the times you had to build tools for yourself. You had to construct stuff that you made work. I remember my uncle, he's like a fisherman who built his old nets. He constructed these whole mechanisms to sort of catch fish efficiently. All of it was motorized. All of it was just him. And I was there observing and kind of embedding the idea in my head that everything was possible. You could build anything, nothing is outside of domain that you can't build, that you can't really copy yourself and make yourself. Of course, it didn't work as well as some of the rigs that are on the market, but it worked quite well. So I think I would say that was the biggest maybe contributor to my childhood fascination, is the fact that I got the idea that anything could be built if you just put your mind to it.
Now, moving forward. So you got a PhD in tactile perception, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's right. In robotics and haptics. Yeah.
So how do you feel that your career has evolved from the time you got your PhD to now that you're focused on robotics and AI in law enforcement?
Yeah, it's shifted quite drastically. In my PhD, I was really focused on building mechanisms to essentially capture tactile information from the world and then play it back on a digital device. So I'm wearing a sweater now, and one of my PhD things was recreating the feeling of a sweater on a flat screen. So yeah, that sounds pretty fancy, and we got close. We understood. And part of the things I've done in my PhD is really figure out what's missing, how we can improve it. And so it was quite a reward. I would say it was a pretty good PhD. I'm quite happy with it. Not a lot of people can say that. As in, like, not a lot of people feel like they've done something, but I feel like I've contributed a good amount. I'm happy with it. And I was very happy to get out and do something else by the time it was over. And one of the primary shifts was that I started doing software, and software in academia is quite different. You're writing software to get something to work and to publish as soon as possible. And software in the industry is really about building something that, years down the line doesn't break and it still works and is there for years, and it gets used every single day. In the past, I if I were to think of how many people got influenced in some way, how many users basically interacted with a feature or something I've built, it's in the hundreds of thousands at this point. And it's kind of humbles you in some ways, because it makes you very aware of the fact that you have to check everything multiple times, and just getting something to work is not enough. You have to make sure that all the corner cases are covered, it's tested. So it's quite different from academia. In academia, if you got something to work, you'd never looked at that code again. It works. It's done. So quite a different mindset. Absolutely.
So that's your motivation for shifting to from academia, or?
Well, I shifted from academia for many reasons. I've always loved science, but academia and science, I figured out are quite different entities. There's a Venn diagram, but of course they're not one on one. They're sort of separate. And so I sort of realized I like to do science and this sort of discovery and this kind of work on my own time, and structure my career around something different. Motivations were deep. It wasn't just I liked the topic or something, or, I wanted to go to industry. It was just that it felt easier and I could do a lot more, being in industry actually than academia. Yeah.
Yeah. So I can see how you moved away from academia. What I'm very, very curious about is Why law enforcement in the first place? That sounds very interesting.
Law enforcement is a very recent change for me. I actually didn't even apply to Axon directly. A recruiter reached out to me. I was working in telecom before that, and before that, I was working in a haptics company, startup, developing these tactile screens that I was studying in my PhD. But out of all the companies that I saw, I was out in the market and I got reached out by this recruiter. And out of all the companies that I saw, I sort of felt law enforcement is one place where the stakes are so high for what you're doing, and you have to get it right. And that's the fact that it's so challenging because of all the, in the past couple of years, I feel like law enforcement has changed a lot. There's a lot of bad reputation, a lot of awareness that's come about. And I love the fact that it's such a challenging environment, and it's so you can contribute a lot, and things you do really matter. So it's a high stakes environment, which I really appreciate.
Yeah. Law enforcement seems to be a hot topic these days for whatever reason in our culture. It's constantly being talked about. So let's bring all these elements together. Your expertise spans robotics and computer vision. So what are you doing these days in order to integrate these technologies to solve real world problems in law enforcement? Give us a behind the scenes, Roman in this field.
Yeah, I work on some of the newer technologies. So I'll speak kind of broadly about what Axon is doing, and then, just hint to the fact that I'm working on some of these things. Axon's got quite a bit of, Axon is a company I work for, by the way. I don't think we mentioned the name, and it deals basically with building, it was focused on building hardware for law enforcement, but now it's shifting towards software as well, because as you can imagine, there's a lot of need for analytical tools, a lot of need for interpretation of the data that's collected in real time and offline as well. One of the big tools that we have is it's called Draft One. It basically transcribes everything that's recorded by body-worn cameras, by any equipment that has a microphone, picks it up, then it transcribes to a text. And all of that goes into evidence and then gets sent out. And so the police officer doesn't have to spend time drafting this report. It's sort of transcribed. They just have to check off that it's correct, and then it's sent off. It's done. All the pictures that are taken by the cameras, all the videos get placed into one. Now it's an evidence storage, and it's done. You can manipulate it post time. It's there for anybody, for the law enforcement to review. And I think it's these sorts of tools that ease the life of a police officer, I think, are really very beneficial. That's something that's very exciting to me. Reducing the extraneous stuff that like an official in such a high responsibility, high power position has to do, I think, is very important. Just have them focused on what they need to do.
Can you briefly describe exactly in the business model how Axon commercializes their products and services? Is it are there a lot of competing firms like Axon doing similar things with different jurisdictions or metro areas or police entities, or like exactly how would you describe the field?
Yeah, I think that Axon has a very good foothold, and so they are shifting toward being vertically integrated, which is a very powerful tool in the market, right? If you have hardware and software and you own, it's all proprietary, you own everything, it's quite a lead, I would say, in competitors. And there's some competitors. Of course, there's companies developing cameras, body-worn cameras, and vehicle dash cams. But the offer that Axon has is the fact that in the age of AI, for example, all of that, besides collecting the video and the data, all of that gets stored properly, and you can review it, and it gets interpreted correctly as well. And so besides just, sampling data and having it there, the tools are much, much deeper. I think there's a lot of, hardware has been figured out. You can put a camera in your car and it's done. There you go. You don't need You don't need a company that's dedicated to doing that to do that. But the stuff that's necessary is to do all the behind the scenes work that officers in the past have had to do, but now it's done automatically, right? And so that's a significant. I think that's that's what Axon is really providing there. Yeah.
So, how can all this technology, robotics, computer vision, etc., can contribute to make law enforcement safer and more efficient in your mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't predict. Of course, you can take the concept of automation in law enforcement to many places. Some of them don't look so good. In my mind, I like to keep a positive spin on it because I think the fact that we have humans that are constantly being bombarded with very sensitive environments, they're seeing murder, they're seeing a lot of very traumatic things that I don't think we're meant to deal with. It's very difficult to deal with all this information, and I don't think anybody should. So, in any place where human and other factor of the other side of this is that humans are notoriously bad at making decisions sometimes. To prepare for this podcast, I had a little story that I read years ago about the fact that judges, for example, they have positive outcomes in their rulings about 65% of the time in the morning, and then it goes down to about 0 right before lunchtime. And after they had a break, it goes back up to about 65%. So they get officers are in a body that has needs, and they're making life or death decisions at a moment's notice. Sometimes it's not good. They're biased. They're overloaded with information, overloaded with thinking about their safety and how what they're doing is going to be perceived. It's all this data that's coming in. It's a very high stress job that I think should be automated to an extent to help out. So there's a lot of opportunity to make it easier on the officers, and a lot of opportunity to make it easier also on those being enforced, because I think a lot of people would want to deal with something that makes judicial decisions that are not based on whether or not the person has had lunch yet. These sorts of things. So, yeah. And he's shaking his head in disbelief. Yeah, it's.
No, it's just fascinating. I think that's probably why we're both shaking our heads here. So there's one thing, very different industry, more from the aviation. In fact, I've got a pilot license, and the one thing that we have to learn is self-awareness, if you will, or awareness of your environment, and making decision on a real-time basis, right? So I can just imagine that law enforcement is about self-awareness or awareness of your environment, and also making decisions very, very, very quickly, right? And making the right decisions, in fact. So could you explain how AI is transforming law enforcement and their tools specifically, and more specifically in surveillance, monitoring, awareness of your environment, and real-time decision-making?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Well, if you think about it, an officer driving a vehicle, they're limited in their perception. They've got eyes and ears, mostly eyes at that point because they're inside a vehicle. But, having recordings, 360 recordings, and having some intelligence that maps all the information into a space that can be, then interpretation can be drawn out of. It's super powerful. I feel like we're limited as humans. We're limited in terms of how we perceive information. Just fundamentally, we're biased to see certain things. We're not getting the true idea of what's going on most of the time. We're also limited because it's limited just in scope. We don't have eyes all over the place. We don't have ears, everywhere. So just, the input side of the information is limited. And then the interpretation is limited as well. you think you know what is happening, but something else could be happening. And fundamentally, we also have to communicate all this information between officers, for example, in order to make a decision, right? And that's limited as well. So the communication part is limited. Well, if you have a concrete, central computing machine that takes information in and potentially delegates, but gives an idea of what's going on, gives a better idea of what's going on to the officers. I think that's and can communicate effectively as well. I think that's a powerful tool. I think all of these things, of course, all of them are doable. All of them are sort of within the realm of possibility. The challenging part is, there's many challenging parts to this, like integrating this sort of technology into everyday officer use is very difficult. The other part is the ethics of it are quite an important conversation as well, because you're building something that is potentially a surveillance apparatus, right? And that's I don't believe that that's the best route. In my thinking, the best tools we can build are the ones that are very useful and very hard to make, be used for bad means. Like the transcribing tool, for example, it's extremely useful, and what it does is just stupidly collects all the information, just transcribes it. That's an amazing tool. But in terms of surveillance and all of these other things, you have to be very careful, of course. You don't want to create situations where I think people are surveilled all the time. And of course, once you have enough data to pursue a suspect and to, if very effectively get a hold of them, catch them. So
I guess you mean different things by surveillance. There's a broad definition, because when you mention surveillance to me, I think of Europe the last 10 years, where there's a camera on every single corner and every square foot is covered from surveillance. It's not specific to a person or a crime or anything. It's just in general. Right?
Oh, what you're referring to? You're saying the surveillance you're referring to is the general surveillance, not the
exactly. And you're referring to more specific surveillance, right?
Well, I was talking about the general one, but I think when the word surveillance is said, there's a very concrete sort of picture of cameras, right, looking down on corners, on streetlights. The surveillance I have in mind is more on the spot. When the scene is being surveilled, for example, it's very pointed to the specific problem at hand. Some cases being investigated, for example, or something that's going on the ground, and you have all these cars. Just an example: you have all these cars, cameras are running. What is going on around? Can you play back the scene of that night? What is happening? Can you interpret things from what's going on in the environment and things like that? The problem is that a lot of the time, to some extent, things are already being surveilled because people have cameras in their homes, and they're already, a lot of times when something happens, somebody has a camera on and pointing in that direction, whether or not they pulled it out themselves or there's a home camera. And then the interpretation part is sort of difficult, piecing all of these things together into one concrete idea of what's going on. That can be a lot of useful work that can be done there. Yeah.
And that's where the, sometimes bias can be in the way, right? So often you get the data, but you have a certain interpretation. To your point, you have a certain interpretation of the data. So how do you address bias with AI? How do you make sure that you maintain accuracy, and especially in the high stakes environments, right, where decisions will have consequences?
Boy, no easy questions from Olivier today. It's a difficult question because bias sometimes is wrong, but sometimes it's based on facts. So it biases you, right, toward a specific outcome. And so, for example, if you have two suspects on the scene and one is male, one is female, of course, the bias is toward the male being the perpetrator just because the likelihood is higher. Is that a bad bias, or is that just using data, to back up the decision? So how do you, I personally think that if you have I personally feel like accuracy is more important, right? You want to be accurate to the data. And bias, if their bias emerges, it's a statistical bias that's there in the world, right? And but that's a tough thing to, I think that's a very tough thing to explain. Of course, because there's probably two camps of people. There's camps of people that want everything to be equal upon everybody. And there's another group of people that would probably say, well, the world is uneven. Let's put effort where most probable outcome, like most likely outcome is, right? Why do we want to be even on the input if the outcome is definitely going to be slanted toward the perpetrator, right? At the end of the day, we want to bias ourselves toward the correct answer. So that's a very difficult question. I think, yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the main problems with AI is a technology built by human beings who are already biased, right? So all that data is there. So we need to find a way. I'm not quite sure if it's going to be very easy how easy or difficult it will be to remove any kind of bias. And what we mean by bias, to your point, depends on, I guess, the context, depends on a lot of things. What could be biased to you may not be biased to me.
That's right. And the fact is that as these models get more and more complex, it'll be harder and harder to explain that the bias that exists on output is not manipulated bias, that it is a true mapping that's done. Because a lot of the time it's not, you can't interpret what's going on in this black box, right? And so proving
in fact,
that
you can't really.
You can't.
It's a black box for a reason.
That's right. So to explain that it's not a bias introduced intentionally by humans, I think would be more or less impossible. You'll just have to be very transparent with how these tools are being trained and, what is going on the training side. But other than that, even then, you can't really prove that something hasn't been manipulated with and it's not biased in a certain way. Because you could do a lot of, AI nowadays, there's very interesting ideas being flown around. Like there's watermarks you can embed into AI just to verify that the model is of a specific version, for example, or things like that. So you can embed certain pathways for data to flow easier and to sort of like bias it in some ways. So you could definitely do that. So they can be tricked. They're not perfect, and we're just starting out with using them. So that's another thing. We can't rush to use this toward things that can have consequences down the line for people, like for decades. But on the other hand, humans have always been biased, and more biased, I would say, than acceptable. And many people have suffered. So in some ways, another argument could be, well, really, could it, if we're careful, would it be really that much worse? And I think I would say no. I would say we can.
I personally think I would say no as well.
Yeah,
I think the machines will be more objective than subjective.
For sure.
That's right. Yes, I agree.
But
I'm actually going to insert a little story. I don't even know if this relates to it, but I did some research, and the number one area of videos that are watched on TikTok and YouTube are around law enforcement and interdiction issues with people trying to set up law enforcement or law enforcement interacting with the populace in various ways. Just because I think it's just a fascinating universal attraction for people to see. Not necessarily good and evil, but two elements of society coming together to resolve or address a conflict in some way, shape, or form. I remember back in 1990, and it went from like nothing to number one TV show in the nation, Cops. And I used to just like, as soon as Cops went on, and Cops basically made Fox. It turned Fox into like the station it was. And boy, I watched every single episode of that with my wife. And that was actually when I was at grad school at Northwestern too. And when I had to take a break between studies, we had to watch these videos of cops chasing people around, which is kind of crazy. But there is a relationship there somewhere. The other thing I was going to point out that this topic fascinates me to no ends, actually, so much so. And I remember watching Cops with my son, and he really got into video technology and technology in general. He went to Stanford and got a STS degree, which is Science, Technology, and Society, which basically is dealing with the ethical concerns of a rapidly scaling technology-centric world, which I think is kind of very aligned with what you're talking about today. But to continue on with the subject, I'd like to ask you sort of, again, what ethical considerations are you and Axon, what sort of definitions or inputs do you and Axon have in regards to developing AI systems? How is that structured? How is that written down? How are ethics integrated or addressed throughout the development process?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I would say I know a part of it. I can't speak for the whole, company. I'm sure the board reviews things very carefully whenever, new technology is being proposed, and the optics of it. Of course, it's one company where there's a lot of eyes on it in terms of. There's a lot of eyes on many companies, but it's a very sensitive sort of area, right? Because you're dealing with life and death scenarios.
How much does the company even dictate, or is that basically they are more or less absolved from this area of ethics and AI development because they are serving a customer who is determining that? The customer determines, where that line is drawn and what they need, and you just serve the customer.
No, there are definitely a lot of ethics discussion. Everybody at the company goes through ethics training to make people aware about the very thing we were talking about, biases, and the community we're serving at large. Who this is for? What is? Of course, we're selling. Multiple thousands of these devices to police officers, but there's a lot of effect in the community that this has, and I would say we're pretty conscious of what's going on, how this affects. At the very least, the discussions are happening. Of course, decision making is where the top decision makers is where a lot of things happen. We can interpret and read about what's going on and understand what the company's doing, but at the very top is where it's happening. And I'm pretty happy. I mean, our CEO is very transparent about the technology and about their moves to, with regards to ethics, because there used to be an ethics board at Axon that was diverted, or I think they were dissolved. And there was a good reason for it, I would say. It's just the optics of it are not very good. And so with a company like Axon, optics are extremely important. And there's two sides, I would say. There's optics, and of course there's true ethics. There's how things look and whether or not you're actually following, good code, and you're no pun intended with code, by the way. Good code of conduct, I meant. So discussions are happening. People are very aware of what they're doing. As a company, I would say Axon is doing quite well. There's a lot of community outreach, a lot of community, just in general communication and understanding like what like Axon communicates with mayors of cities, for example, and high officials in terms of what the city needs, what's happening, what are people missing, what is the typical interaction with a police officer look like, right? What is that? Where are the very high charge areas where Axon can contribute or make things easier, better, more ethical overall? There's a lot of these things. I would say Axon. I'm not speaking, not talking because I work here. Trying to be as little as biased as possible, but I think is doing a lot of good work in that area. Absolutely, yeah.
So we've talked about the industry, about the technology, about AI, and specifically one thing that is extremely important, obviously, with technology, products, services, anything we do is the people who actually create all that stuff, right? So, and I can imagine in today's world that you work with distributed teams. I mean, everybody's remote, more or less. How has it been for you so far?
Yeah, it's an interesting experience. I work fully remote. I love it and I hate it at the same time. I love it because there's a lot more time on my hands, and I hate it because I don't think I use that time as efficiently as I could if I was in the office. And of course, I think for engineering, it's so important to talk to people in person, and you find things out in 10 seconds that might take days. Otherwise, there's just hidden communication that goes on between people that, video conferencing just can't do, or text. So, we are working with distributed teams. We have a team in Vietnam, actually teams all over the world and all over, United States. So, different time zones, of course, all challenges with setting up a meeting. Somebody has to wake up at 6 and the person has to stay up until 10, all these things. It's fun. It's interesting to see people sleepy while you're yawning because you're trying to go to bed. They just woke up and they're looking for their coffee. I would say communication has been very important. Constantly talking to people that maybe a bit more than you would normally, because normally you have the added benefit of them being nearby, or you just kind of like nod at them or say hello in the hall, and you sort of like know where they're at, and can, they're framed somehow in your mind about who they are, where they're at, and you are missing that, of course, with conferencing and in the age of Slack. And so, I would say what's helped a lot is just talking to everybody. Checking in once a week or so with something, just making sure they're aligned on something. And my Slack messaging is full. Somebody's replying or asking me the same thing, and so. Constant communication has been very good, and because it's so easy, there's no reason not to do it. You can get a little tiring, of course, because if you feel like you're always in. My phone has Slack. I thought it was a great idea, but now I'm realizing I'm replying late at night.
You're 24/7, essentially. So.
That's the problem, like you're supposed to be given more time with remote work, but then you realize that it just stretches. I feel like the time just stretches and captures all parts of your life. Now work has become like constant. Maybe it trickles, but it's more consistent throughout the day.
Sometimes you like that, and sometimes you don't. Right? Sometimes you like the flow of things, things like flow. And other times you're like, I wish it wouldn't flow. I want to compartmentalize it for my own sanity. Right.
Yeah. There's something to leaving the office at 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever. And just saying, I'm done for the day. No matter what's happening, I'm done. It's Thursday or Friday. I'm not receiving any messages. I'll deal with it on Monday. And the thing is, I have the power to do that. The problem is that I don't, and most people don't. So. Yeah.
Well, see, that's something you guys can work on. For example, I have a no meeting Wednesday, which things flow here, and we deal with global teams all over the world and projects and clients all over the world. Things flow, but because I've set a rule so that I can execute and organize things, and everything that happens on the weekend or Monday and Tuesday, I can now get aligned with or ahead of, so that I go into Thursday and Friday. Now, that doesn't work for everyone. There's different models and different methods, but it's something to think about as a team and as an individual, and to how that can work together so that people feel that right balance of space and cleaning their own cache. And
that's right. Yeah. From that, one more thing I want to say is it becomes very important to balance. And one of the things is I've definitely felt that I feel in some parts more unproductive because I am in the environment of comfort, and that's a dangerous kind of thing to feel, because if you constantly feel unproductive, you constantly feel like you have to compensate and do something. And it's 5:00. Well, you've been at home waiting for somebody to respond, so that's the time you try to fill in. But of course, it hasn't been super productive, because it would have been easier if you were in person. You could have gone ahead and worked with them for 15 minutes, things like that. But now it's 5. So what do? Do you continue working, or once you got that message, do you just say I'll do it tomorrow? And more and more I'm finding that I'm continuing working. It's not good. But in some ways the world is changing, and it's changed after COVID, and there's great power with it. It's just you have to be very careful about how it may trick you to actually work more, and all these things you have to sort of consider you never had to consider before, because the office model is so simple. You go, you work, you leave. It's been embedded into our culture for decades. So you've seen movies around it. You've seen it's just so vivid, in your brain.
Grass is always greener.
Yeah, that's also true. Yeah.
We're definitely in the era of change. Definitely.
Yeah.
And talking about change, technology evolves every day, right? So how do you stay ahead of trends and innovations, especially in robotics and AI? That's even faster than anything else.
How do I stay ahead of it?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
or at least in tune with the trends, and slightly ahead of trends and innovations.
So one thing, in academia, I would say it would be much more critical to stay ahead, because you are innovating, you are producing something that's very new or quite new. You have to be at the bleeding edge of what's happening. And in the industry, it's sort of the case, but then there's a lot of other interests that are happening, a lot of other priorities, and I'd say it's not as critical. I like to stay ahead of things just because I'm a curious person, and I like to know where things are heading and guess how things might be useful for us. But of course, I can't just get up and implement something tomorrow for my company. There's a log of things. There's a plan for the next 3 to 5 years about what we need to do. And so I think there's a buffer zone in terms of innovation and actually companies following suit. But in my own time, I read a lot of AI things. I try to understand what the gaps are and who might fill them and how they might be filled. And it's sort of more a curiosity thing. But I would say in the industry, it's not so much of a concern, being like on the bleeding edge. Unless you're a startup, of course, then you're staying up all night to make sure you're the first and you've got everything sorted out and you're using this brand new technology and, all of that good jazz. But yeah, a company like Axon, that hasn't been so much of an issue.
I think you used a very interesting word, curious. Being curious, I think will keep you at least, maybe not ahead, but close to be ahead and at least engaged, I would say.
Yeah, I feel the pulse.
Right. Yeah.
Well, look, I'm curious about always being ahead of everyone else in a conversation about the future of robotics and law enforcement. So can you give myself and Olivier and the listeners a little bit of insight into what the future looks like in 2 to 4 to 6 years? What might you guys be thinking about? What is law enforcement looking for from a company like Axon?
It's a great question. There's so many low hanging fruits, honestly. Like, just to give an example, ankle bracelets, right? Stuff you're giving, to folks on parole. They're so awful, so behind the times. It's insane. And we're using them to such an extended manner that it's almost embarrassing. If Axon tomorrow said, let's make better ankle bracelet, they'll be in business. They would make a lot of money off of that. There's tiers to your question about what does law enforcement look like. There's the futuristic idea, the Robocop that's been drifted through our conversation, like this idea. And of course, who knows, some automation may reach that, that corner, and we may go in that direction where,
you got robo-dogs at Mar-a-Lago. Is that
that's right.
Future, right?
Yeah. Strip a gun in the thing and we're good to go. Right. Attack on sight. No, I'm kidding. Of course, if there's a Robocop, I would say it probably shouldn't have a gun, and it probably should just handle, very light situations, potentially, like traffic, very mundane things. And then more as the situation rises in the risk, of course, they get outfitted with more, with tools to fit their purpose. But just very fundamentally, there's a lot of, innovation that just doesn't happen in the sector. And, there's a lot of low hanging fruit. Again, everywhere. I would say anybody who goes into this business would make money, because there's a lot of things that need to get done.
Is anything possible, or how much, or what certain things could be, just sort of dismissed, at least in the relative near term, regarding conspiracy theories? Obviously, people were saying shots and microchips, and vaccinations, in having microchips or just embedding them in various ways, or
embedding them into suspects, you mean, so that you can track them?
Yeah, things like that. You got them in dogs, right? You got them in pets.
You do, but
it's a police state then, right?
Yeah, then it's police state. You do have them, but they're activated in some. Don't they just have like an ID? They're like IR ID. They're not GPS enabled at all, so you can't really track them.
They're just an ID, I think.
They're just an ID. Yeah.
Plus, that requires quite a bit of power. If you think about it, you have to.
Yeah.
Right.
You have to transmit your location, right?
True.
Yeah.
It's not just receiving; it's transmitting as well.
Yeah.
Well, there's also concern of power, right? How do you power this thing? So technology, of course, is always going to be limited by how it's powered, and you can't automate every single thing and make it a smart, IT device, because you're just missing power in places where you can't afford extra weight. So that's always going to be a problem. But in vehicles, likely in police vehicles, they're hooked up to the battery, and so police cars are getting better. There's a lot of technology there. Axon is working on, and I've worked on the cameras, on like front-facing cameras inside police cars, and interior cameras that are reading things like license plates, for example, and then they're interpreting, and there's an alert if there's a suspect. For example, if there's a license plate that's been flagged for some reason, anytime a police car passes by it, of course, it records. It finds the location of the police car and says this car was here at this point and at this time, and so you can track people this way. And there's a lot of tools like this. Of course, chips. I don't know, Andy. I don't think anybody would agree to that deal to get a chip embedded. I don't know if we'll allow as a society for chips to be embedded for monitoring. But even if we don't do chips, if we do a ankle monitor, I think things could be improved dramatically. And that was just an example. There's weapons, there's defense, for example, body armor. Even body armor is behind the times in some ways, Yeah.
Does Axon partner with companies like, I don't know, for example, like Tesla that spend so much on AI and vision identification and things like that?
Nope, they figured it out themselves.
Wow,
that's the
is
power.
That a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a great thing.
Yeah.
It's a great thing because you can control what's going on. You've got the whole apparatus right at your fingertips. You can tune it. You can do anything you want with it. You can use it for another project. You can test it very efficiently. So it's a great thing. I think, Axon being so, like, they're vertically integrated and
completely independent.
Yeah. Completely independent. Yeah. It's a fantastic thing. Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. Very good. Well, thank you for joining us today, Roman. Your insights into AI and robotics, particularly their applications in law enforcement, were incredibly enlightening. To our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this deep dive into how technology is reshaping industries in critical and meaningful ways. And if you love this episode, subscribe to the show and please leave a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform. Join us next time for more conversations about software innovation and its transformative impact. Thank you very much.